Hello, I'm here at Union Project, which is the nonprofit that uses arts to bridge gaps between communities. And as you can see, I'm down here in our studio space. Today, it's a space that artists use for their own workspace, and it's also a space where we teach classes. So I'm here today to take you along with me and show you a little bit about the process of throwing on the wheel. So I'm going to suit up and take you along with me. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do after I get my apron on is to prep our clay for the throwing process. And one of the things that's great about the ceramic process is that the materials that you use, the clay, can be recycled and reused. And so anytime that you mess up or something doesn't go right, if you haven't fired it in a kiln yet, you can just recycle it and start over. So the clay that I have here, freshly recycled clay, but we use a big mixer that does turn a lot of air into it. So the first thing that we're going to do with this fresh clay is use this wedging table back here to get things ready to go. All right, so wedging is going to do a couple things for us. The first thing, and the main thing that it does, is it's going to work any air bubbles out of the clay. So you can see we're sort of working in this spiralized way, and as we work through the clay, we're going to slowly be popping all the air bubbles that we run into. Air bubbles can be a problem for a couple reasons. They can cause cracking later on in the process, but primarily the reason we want to get air bubbles out of the clay is because they just make the artist's process a little bit more difficult at every step of the way. It makes trimming harder, it makes throwing harder, it just makes everything a little bit more bumpy and out of whack. So we want to wedge pretty thoroughly to work any air bubbles out that we can. The other thing that wedging does is it starts to align all of those particles in the clay into this spiralized pattern, and that's just kind of going to make throwing on the wheel a little easier because we're going to be throwing the clay in a circular way as well. So this is just sort of starting that process going, getting the clay to the point where it is happy to work with us in that way. There are a couple different types of wedging. This type of wedging is commonly called monkey face wedging. Now you kind of know why. There you go. All right, this clay is wedged and ready to throw. We're going to jump into the fun part. So I've got my wedged clay here, and the first thing we have to do is center this clay. And so for starters, I just like to throw it as close to the center as I can. Get it suctioned on there. I'm starting with a rather big piece of clay because I'm just planning to play around a little bit and see what we get, which I don't get to do very often. It's always kind of fun. So I have these circles that can help me sort of approximate where the center is. All right, I'm on. I'm gonna get my wheel going. So the goal for the beginning of this, before you can really mess around with the shape at all, is to get your clay nice and centered. And I'm doing that by getting the clay pretty wet and then alternating pressure from the top and the side back and forth, and I'm slowly working it into a nice compact centered shape. Takes a little bit of muscle, so that's why I sound a little funny while I'm talking. But you can see it's starting to get a little bit more even. I'm going to use my sponge to pull some of that clay in a little bit. All right. So it might seem like I'm doing this by visuals, but really I'm doing a lot more of it by feel. You can be a lot more exact by the way the clay feels in your hand than by the way it looks. All right, I'm getting close. And you can see that I'm moving my hands pretty slowly as I work, and that's because you need to, whenever you are changing the clay, you want to change it at all parts all around the clay as it spins, and if you move your hands too fast, you're going to affect maybe one side of it and not the other. So this is pretty nicely centered, but if I were to take my hands off really quickly, you can see it's knocked it off a little. So I've got to make sure that I'm going nice and slow. All right, I'm going to call this pretty well centered. It helps to have this clay nice and wet so it can glide pretty easily through your hands. So once you have it centered, we're going to start to change the shape, and at every step along the way I'm going to be doing my best to keep it centered, although that can be a challenge. So the next thing we're going to do is start the hole in the middle that will grow it larger, but we have to first start by going as deep as we want. So here we go. Take the water out from the inside so I can see, and it looks pretty deep. We've got a hole that's about this deep right now. All right, more water. And now I'm going to attempt to widen that hole so that we can have either a bowl that holds a lot of stuff or a vase that holds a lot of flowers. Nice and slow. So I've widened out the hole quite a bit, which also gives me a nice floor to my pot. So I'm just kind of compressing the bottom a little bit because that's one spot where sometimes I get cracks if I'm not careful. All right. This next bit is what I would consider the most tricky part. It's called pulling up, and it's where we're going to start to give some height to this piece. The walls are pretty thick, so we're going to use the thick extra clay and turn that into height. But this is the spot where if I mess up, it falls, so we'll see. I'm going to slow my wheel down a little bit. Pinch and slowly move my hands up the side. All right, not too bad. Got a lot of clay here to work with. So as I go, I sometimes like to just feel around and see how thin or thick it is. I can see if I have some thick spots to take care of or some thinner spots that I need to be careful of. Because if you accidentally go too thin, your piece will fall. Let's see if I can make it a little skinnier. Bring it in. All right, I'm going to slow this down even a little more. It's almost as skinny as I want it to be. I've got one thick spot I want to take care of, and then I'm going to start seeing if I can mess around with the shape. Right. Sometimes as you make a pot skinnier, it makes that top part a little uneven, which you might be able to see right now. That's okay, we'll fix that in a second. This is sometimes called choking in as you make your pot skinnier, which you could probably imagine why. All right, let's see. Before I make that top part even, when you bring it in, sometimes it can get a little thicker, so I'm gonna just do one more pull, sort of even things out. Great. Guess we're going for a vase shape. basically when you throw on the wheel, it feels like everything you do is a chance for everything to go wrong and fall over. But that's part of the adventure of it. So I'm going to slow this down. I'm going to try and even out this lip here. Yeah. Right. I'm going to attempt to make this a little bit bottle shaped and go in more. So I'm going to, before I make it too skinny, I've got to reach my sponge in and get all that extra water out. There we go. Maybe I will round out the bottom a little by putting a little pressure from the inside. See that shape changing a little bit? All right. Let's see what we can do. Let's see if I can squeeze my hand inside this small hole. I don't know what to do next. Maybe I'll. All right. I think we're discovering its final form. I think we've got the final form of our big vase here. I'm gonna spin it just to, I think I can get my hand in here. Maybe, ooh, I might have squished it a little. I'm gonna try to get the rest of that water out. I got a little more in there. Might have stretched this a little. Let's see if I can. Just want it a little wider at the top. Here we go. All right. This wood tool here, I like to use to cut around the bottom and get rid of some of that extra clay. So, go in nice and slow. So you can sort of see that once you get the basics of throwing, you can have a lot of fun just sort of playing around with form. Grab this extra clay around the edge. All this clay is going to be recycled. A big barrel that all goes in. A little bit more. So once you get to this stage, the clay is really wet because you've been using water this whole time. So we're gonna cut the piece off, move it to this board over here, and then it will have to sit and firm up for a while before you can finish the piece. So the cutting I did at the bottom here was to sort of get it closer to its final form, but we're gonna wanna do something called trimming at the end that really finishes up that pot, but you can't do it while it's this wet. So I've got my wire tool here. I'm just going to drag it underneath. Clean off my wire, and then I'm gonna use a little water here. And I like to just pull this puddle of water underneath. If you saw it budge a tiny bit, I'm just sort of breaking that surface tension. So it's easier to get this pot off. And then, let's see what we can do. I'm gonna dry off my hands. We'll see how easy or difficult this piece wants to be to move. Not too bad. There we go. So on this piece over here that I just finished throwing, we were talking about how the bottom will need to be finished, but we have to wait quite a while for it to dry and firm up enough. So earlier I threw a couple smaller pieces just so I could show you the process of what it looks like to finish the bottom of the piece. This process is called trimming, and I have it upside down and centered on here so that I can spin it upside down and trim from there. And these chunks of clay here are just there to hold it in center, so hopefully I don't knock it off. Then I've got a couple trimming tools here. And this guy. So I like to start by just giving myself kind of a guide of where I want to cut. So basically I'm going to be using these tools to sort of cut away extra clay so it's not too thick of a bottom and so it's the shape that I like. All right, so it's trimmed, and I'm just gonna use a damp sponge to smooth out all my cut marks. This trimming stage is really what gives it its final shape. And also makes it look nice and finished. Thanks, guys. It's the same damp sponge just to finish off that lip. And then you can see we've got a nice finished piece. So that's what we will do to that one once it dries. Through another little, this is just a little tiny bud vase. Another way to finish off a piece that isn't trimming is just to take a tool, smooth it out. Like to give it a little indent, and then just taking your thumb, giving it kind of a nice bevel, just so it's just a different look. Depending on your style, depending on the piece. And the great thing about ceramics is that there are a million right ways to do something. Every artist finds their own style and their own techniques and methods. Yeah, so all of these pieces, once they're trimmed, they have to be really thoroughly dried. If we put them in the kiln to fire them while they're wet, they'll break. So we have to make sure they're really carefully dried, which takes a more or less time depending on the season. But once it's fully dried, it goes through 2 firing processes. It goes into the kiln at a lower temperature, which is called a bisque firing. And that's sort of an initial basic firing, which allows us to put a glaze on it really easily, which will sort of determine the final color and the final look of the surface. And then once you dip it in that glaze, you put it in a second firing that typically goes to a hotter temperature. Here in the studio, we fire most of our stuff to around 2,300 degrees, so it gets pretty hot. Ceramics is a really durable material, and when it comes out of that firing, it looks like it's finished, glossy, ready to use piece. All right, so behind me I have a couple examples of what your ceramics piece could look like once it comes out of that final glaze firing. Depending on what glazes you dip it in, there's a whole variety of colors and textures that you could get on your final piece. But no matter how many years I've done ceramics for, there's always an element of surprise. Every time you open a kiln, you're never quite sure if you're going to get what you expect or if there's a surprise waiting for you inside that kiln. There's always a chance for something unexpected. I hope you enjoyed this journey with me and maybe learn something new about ceramics.